The body was found on the plaza at dawn. That was how Marin Voss first heard the name Eli Dresch, not from the broadcast feeds, not from the resistance network she monitored from a cramped relay station near the old transit hub, but from the mouth of a frightened cargo hauler who had stumbled across something bleeding on the open concourse and done what humans do. She stopped. She knelt. She called for help on a frequency the consortium monitored and flagged as low priority, because a single injured human on a public walkway was not an event worth routing to their emergency responders. Not anymore. Marin was a journalist. She had been one before the occupation, through the occupation, and she intended to remain one after it, an aspiration that had aged badly in the 17 years since the Veld made first contact and subsequent first conquest. She worked out of a repurposed storage unit in Sector 9, surrounded by dead hardware she had learned to resurrect and living informants she had learned to protect. She was 34 years old, which in 2089 meant she had been 11 when the sky turned wrong, 12 when the broadcast stopped, 13 when the new infrastructure went up and the old governments went down. She had grown up inside the defeat. She did not remember anything else. When the hauler's distress call bounced through the secondary relays and landed in Marin's queue, she almost didn't pull it. There were 100 distress calls on any given morning. The consortium's social architecture had been engineered to produce exactly this volume. Enough human suffering to keep the underclass occupied with its own survival, not enough to constitute an emergency requiring Veld administrative intervention. It was a precision instrument. Marin had spent 6 years documenting its tolerances. She pulled the call because the caller said a name, Eli Dresch, born January 1st, 2059, one of 10 children selected at birth by the old ZDG documentary program to be filmed continuously for the first 30 years of their lives. The Millennium Children, they'd been called, before the Veld arrived and the documentary became something else, a record of what it cost to be young and human in a world remade for other purposes. Marin had watched every broadcast. She knew Eli's face the way people know the faces of friends they've never met. His mother's dark eyes, his father's stubborn jaw, the half-smile he made when he was trying not to show he was frightened. She pulled the call, and then she pulled on her jacket, and then she went. The city at dawn had a particular quality that Marin had never found words for and had stopped trying. Sector 9 was built on the skeleton of what had been a residential district, apartment blocks, transit corridors, the low-ceilinged commercial spaces that had once sold furniture and coffee and clothes imported from places that no longer imported things. The Veld had left the skeleton intact, largely because demolishing it required resource expenditure they hadn't approved in their administrative budget and repurposed the major infrastructure nodes for their own purposes. The result was a city that looked almost familiar from certain angles and was, from every angle, wrong. The signage was different. The atmospheric processors on every third corner block vented at a temperature slightly below human comfort because they were calibrated for the Veld supervisors who passed through the sector, rather than the 30,000 humans who lived in it. The streetlights ran on a spectrum shifted toward blue, ostensibly for energy efficiency, actually because the Veld found human spectrum lighting aesthetically discomforting, though no Veld administrator had ever said this directly, and the consortium's published efficiency documentation cited compelling numbers. Marin walked through the blue-tinted dawn with her collar up and her recorder running at ambient capture. She always ran the recorder at ambient. You could never know when you were walking through the thing that mattered. The hauler was waiting at the checkpoint near the transit hub, a broad-shouldered woman in her late 40s with the weathered competence of someone who had been moving cargo through occupied territory long, enough that she'd developed a specific philosophy about it. Her name was Orla. She'd been the one to call. He was lying on the west side of the concourse, Orla said. I nearly ran the trolley over him. It was still dark. She had the careful effect of someone managing shock through practical recitation. I pulled the trolley, I got down, I could see he was breathing. I called for medical on the emergency channel. How long was the response? Orla looked at her steadily. They came after 43 minutes, she said. I know because I sat with him until they did. I counted. I do that now. She paused. He was trying to say something. Not to me specifically, just saying something. I couldn't make out the words. He kept reaching for something that wasn't there. Did you recognize him? After they took him, I looked at his registry tag. From the broadcast, the Millennium Program. She crossed her arms over her chest. I watched those broadcasts when I was young. He was the one who, there was an episode when he was 12, he'd won some sort of design award at school, and the documentary team followed him for 3 days. He kept forgetting the camera was there. She stopped. He kept smiling. Marin wrote this down. She wrote everything down. "Thank you," she said, "for staying with him." Orla uncrossed her arms and looked at the empty concourse. "Someone had to," she said. The consortium hospital in Sector 9 occupied what had once been a public medical center. It still looked like one from the outside. The humans who staffed the lower floors had not been permitted to change the signage, as though the word hospital in weathered letters constituted a kind of legal guarantee. Inside, the building had been restructured according to Veld priorities. The upper 4 floors were sealed and climate-controlled for consortium clients. Elevated oxygen, filtered atmosphere, the soft blue light that the Veld found conducive to recuperation. The lower 3 floors remained open to human patients, which meant they were perpetually overcrowded, chronically understaffed, and operating on a supply budget that the consortium reviewed quarterly and cut annually. Eli Dresch had been brought to the lower floors. Marin arrived at the intake desk and gave the name, and the administrator, a thin young man with the hollow eyes of someone who had stopped sleeping, checked his registry and told her that Eli Dresch had been admitted 2 hours ago with critical injuries, had been placed on the surgical wait list, and had died 40 minutes ago awaiting the emergency team. The surgical team was occupied, the administrator said, which was what he'd been told to say. Occupied with what? He looked at the ceiling briefly, a gesture Marin had learned to read as involuntary honesty. Upstairs, he said. Marin wrote it down. She wrote everything down. It was the only thing she knew how to do that still felt like resistance. She stood in the corridor and looked at the intake board. 47 names on the wait list, 3 surgical teams listed as available. 2 of those listed as currently engaged in procedures on the upper floors, which were technically separate facilities with separate surgical budgets, which meant the accounting registered correctly even when the outcome didn't. The 3rd surgical team had been available. The window between Eli's admission and his death, according to the timestamp on the administrator's record, was 1 hour and 18 minutes. Standard emergency surgical response time under the consortium's own medical classification charter was 45 minutes for critical injuries. 1 hour and 18 minutes minus 45 minutes was 33 minutes. 33 minutes was not a rounding error. It was a decision. Marin photographed the intake board. She photographed the timestamp. She was composing a query to the consortium's public record system, a formality she performed because refusals were data too. When someone touched her arm, she turned. The woman was about Marin's age, well-dressed in the way that meant she'd kept her economic classification through the transition years. Dark hair, good coat, the particular expression of someone who hasn't slept and has been crying and is currently pretending to be doing neither. "You're Marin Voss," the woman said. "I've read your documentation. I'm Sophie Dresch, Eli's wife." Marin put the recorder on record openly because concealing it from someone who had come to find her would be a lie she wasn't willing to tell. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. "I don't want sorry." Sophie's voice was quiet but very steady. "I want you to find out what happened, and I want you to understand something first." She looked around the corridor, assessing sightlines the way people did who had learned the hard way that corners had listeners. Eli is not dead. Sophie had received a signal 12 hours before Eli's body turned up on the plaza. It had come through a channel so obscure and so carefully constructed that even Marin, who knew most of the back-channel architecture in Sector 9, didn't recognize the routing. The message was 4 words in Eli's voice, recorded and sent. The audio clipped short as if the transmission had been cut. "I'm still here. Run." He could have recorded that before, Marin said, because she was a journalist and it was her job to say the obvious things. He could have, Sophie said. He didn't. They were sitting in Marin's relay station now, the 2 of them and a 3rd person Marin hadn't expected. Fabian Kreutz, who had also been a Millennium child, who now worked as an unlicensed medic in the deep sectors, and who had the particular stillness of someone who had been in dangerous situations long enough that stillness had become his default posture. He sat with his hands loose in his lap and his eyes moving constantly, cataloging exits, sight lines, the small habituation of someone who lived below the administrative radar and had survived there, because he'd gotten very good at knowing what a room contained. He was the one who had brought Sophie to Marin. They'd known each other through the back-channel medic network, which crossed paths with Marin's journalist network at several nodes she'd spent years building. "Fisher," he said, when Sophie finished explaining the signal. It was the first word he'd spoken since they'd arrived. "Who's Fisher?" Marin asked. "Hospital administrator, upper floors." Fabian's voice was careful, practiced. "He provides a service for people who can't pay their debt classification out of the consortium's registry. There's a procedure. The consortium doesn't know about it or doesn't acknowledge it, which amounts to the same thing administratively. You go in with injuries, you die on paper, your debt record zeroes out. You come out through the service corridors and you go somewhere they don't look. Marin was quiet for a moment, arranging what she'd just heard. He's been faking death, she said. He's been giving people exits, Fabian said, and the correction was gentle but precise. People with nothing left to lose need somewhere to go. Fisher gives them a direction. And where do they go? Fabian and Sophie exchanged a look that Marin couldn't quite read, not reluctance exactly, more like the expression people wore when they were deciding whether to trust a known entity with an unknown outcome. She'd seen that look before in informants. It meant, we've decided yes, but we're noting the moment. There's a sector, Sophie said. The consortium calls it Residual Zone 14. Everyone else calls it something else. What does everyone else call it? Sophie said it quietly. The Hollow. Marin had heard of the Hollow the way you hear of a place from a distance. A name on the back channel feeds. A rumor in the overcrowded corridors of the lower hospital floors. A thing that the consortium's administrative communications referred to only as a low-priority containment zone. In consortium language, low-priority containment zone meant they'd decided it wasn't worth the resource expenditure to dismantle. That phrasing had always struck Marin as revealing. You only called something a containment zone if it contained something. You only called it low priority if you'd assessed the threat and decided it was manageable. She'd filed it mentally as a thing to look at when she had time. She hadn't had time in 6 years. It occupied the eastern quarter of what had been a residential district, sealed off from the main sector grid by 3 checkpoints that the consortium's enforcement units visited approximately once per week, and never with enthusiasm. The residents of the Hollow had stopped paying their debt classifications. They had stopped filing labor availability forms. They had, in the consortium's administrative sense, stopped existing. And the consortium had responded in the way it responded to administrative inconvenience, which was to label it and wait for it to resolve itself. It had not resolved itself. The 3 of them went on foot, because vehicles required route registration and route registration meant consortium tracking. They took the maintenance corridors under the sector grid, Fabian leading with the confidence of someone who had been using these tunnels for years. Sophie close behind him, Marin last with her recording equipment running and her mind filing away the texture of the corridors, the jury-rigged, lighting LED strips powered from junk boxes that someone had spliced into the grid with enough expertise to not trip the monitoring thresholds, the hand-lettered distance markers in 3 different handwriting styles that said different people had been maintaining this network over time. The occasional cluster of blankets or food wrappers that said people lived here too in the spaces beneath the spaces. Humanity, Marin thought, had always been good at finding the cracks and making something of them. They came up through a hatch into gray morning light, and Marin stood still for a moment, looking. The Hollow was not what she had expected. She had expected wreckage. She had prepared herself professionally for the particular visual vocabulary of human desperation she'd spent 6 years documenting: the hollow eyes, the improvised shelters, the specific listless quality of people who have been ground down past the point of caring. What happens next? She'd seen it in a dozen sectors. She knew its grammar intimately, had written it in careful factual prose, and tried to render it with the respect it deserved without making it pornographic. The Hollow had all of those things, in places and something else entirely. It had people working, not performing labor for consortium classification purposes, not filling quotas, not doing the minimum required to keep their records green and their classifications current. Working in the sense of building something, fixing something, understanding how something functioned, because understanding it mattered to them and to the people next to them. There was a water reclamation system in the southeastern corner that someone had assembled from salvaged components Marin recognized as pieces of 3 different Veld administrative systems, cannibalized with the particular ingenuity of someone who has no resources to buy the right tool and therefore becomes very good at understanding what any tool is actually capable of beyond its intended function. There was a medical station staffed by 2 people she'd later learn were a former nurse and a former veterinarian, which combination she'd initially found darkly funny, and then, watching them work, found simply impressive. There was a long corridor that had been converted into a library, physical books, salvaged and traded, covering every surface of improvised shelving with the chaotic abundance of a collection built by accretion rather than design. There were children, and the children were running, and they had the specific energy of children who are not afraid of the ground they're running on. Marin stood with her recorder running, and she watched and she thought, I have been documenting what the consortium system produces, and this is what the consortium system produces. These people, who should by every administrative metric be broken, building a water reclamation system from other people's garbage and teaching each other things in corridors and running. How many people live here? She asked. No one knows exactly, Fabian said. The consortium stopped counting. That was their mistake, Sophie said quietly, not bitterly. Just noting a fact. They found Fisher first. He was a compact, practical-looking man in his 50s, with the manner of someone who had been doing necessary and illegal things for long enough that he'd stopped thinking of them as either. He ran what he called his processing station out of a former laundry facility. 3 rooms, 2 assistants who also served as nurses, a medical kit that was mostly improvised from components he brought in through the service corridors, and a registry system he'd built himself on hardware, so old the consortium's monitoring systems no longer maintained compatibility protocols for it. The kind of invisibility money couldn't buy, but obsolescence could. He looked at Marin's recording equipment with the careful neutrality of someone assessing a threat then at Fabian. She's all right, Fabian said. I've heard that before. You've heard it from me before, Fabian said. I'm still here. Fisher considered this with the brevity of someone who made character assessments quickly, because slow ones had gotten people he cared about arrested. He moved past it. You're looking for Eli Dresch, he said. Is he alive? Sophie asked. He was when I last saw him. Yesterday morning. Fisher sat down on the edge of a repurposed equipment case and rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture of a man who had been running on purpose and insufficient sleep for longer than was medically advisable. He came to me 6 weeks ago. He'd been carrying debt since his grandmother's medical care. You understand the cost structure. You've seen it. You care for someone you love, and you spend the rest of your life paying for it. The consortium's care billing accrues interest on a daily compounding cycle. By the time care is complete and the debt is registered in your classification account, you've already lost ground you'll never recover. He explained it the way someone explains a thing they have had to explain many times, not with anger, but with the particular flat precision of someone who has processed the anger into something more functional. Ely was a graphic designer. He'd had a contract with one of the consortium's approved design firms. They maintain human aesthetic workers because the Veld don't have the specific neural architecture for certain kinds of visual problem solving, which is a fact the consortium finds administratively inconvenient and therefore never publishes. He was good at it. Then the contract ended, the way contracts end when a Veld administrator decides that the resource expenditure has exceeded the utility threshold. He'd been working 3 informal labor positions since: courier, maintenance, translation, keeping his classification current. He was about to lose that too. Why didn't he tell Sophie? Marin asked. Fisher looked at her steadily. Pride, he said, and it wasn't a criticism. It was a diagnosis. He'd watched her succeed. She'd kept her classification, built a real practice, had actual security. He thought it was his failure, not the systems. Most of them do. That's by design too. If you believe your grinding poverty is the result of your personal inadequacy, you spend your energy on shame instead of on understanding why the math was never going to work. Who designed that? Marin said, though she already knew. The consortium's labor classification architects, Fisher said. Whether they knew what they were building is a question I've stopped asking. It doesn't change the outcome. Sophie had been very still through this conversation. Now she said, he was going to send for me. Yes, he was waiting. He wanted, Fisher paused, choosing words with care, he wanted to have something to offer first. A plan, a place. He didn't want you to see the thing he'd become when he had nothing. He wanted you to see the thing he was becoming when he'd found his way back. Sophie said nothing. Her jaw was tight. That's very human of him, Marin said softly, to no one in particular, and very stupid. Most human things are both, Fisher said. That's why I do this. They found Eli in the eastern portion of the hollow, in a workshop that smelled of metal and ozone, and the particular sharpness of systems under power that weren't supposed to be under power. He was sitting at a workbench with 3 other people, all of them bent over a circuit array that incorporated components Marin vaguely recognized as Veld administrative hardware, stripped down and rewired in ways that made her mildly nervous to be in the same room with. He looked up when they came in. He was 30 years old. He looked older in the ways that matter and younger in the ways that surprise you. Documentary had always caught him with a camera-ready quality, the specific self-consciousness of someone who has grown up knowing they were being watched. That quality was gone. Without it, he looked more real. The lines around his eyes, the weight he'd lost, the particular quality of his hands, which were marked with the kind of calluses you get from work, rather than from performance of work. He looked like someone who had been cracked and remade inside the crack, and was still in the process of figuring out what the new shape was. He and Sophie looked at each other across the workshop. There are moments Marin had learned, doing this work, that belonged to the people in them and no one else. She noted the moment, duration, quality, the specific stillness of it, and then she pointed her recorder at the circuit array, away from their faces, because she was a journalist and not a voyeur, and there was a line. Sophie crossed the floor and hit him in the shoulder, hard enough that he stumbled back against the workbench. Then she held him. He held her back. Neither of them said anything for a while, and the three other people at the workbench found things to look at that weren't the two of them, and Fabian stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets and looked at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has seen enough grief and enough reunion that he knows how to make himself peripheral to both. "What are you building?" Fabian asked the others, stepping into the room to give Eli and Sophie the center of it. "A problem," said one of them, a young woman with cropped hair and oil-stained hands and the concentrated expression of someone whose mind was working several steps ahead of the conversation, or a solution. Depends on your relationship to the consortium's node network. Her name was Kira. She'd been an electrical systems engineer before her labor classification lapsed. She explained this with no more drama than she'd used to explain that she'd once had a different haircut. She had the particular quality of brilliance that administrative systems have no category for. The kind that sees what a thing is supposed to do, and then asks what else it could do, what it's actually doing that no one told it to, what it does when it's stressed in directions its designers never tested. What she was building, as near as Marin could follow from the explanation, was an interference system. The consortium administered all sector infrastructure through a distributed node network, power allocation, water distribution, environmental controls, communications routing, labor registry, medical classification. Every system the occupied human population depended on daily ran through nodes that were, by the consortium's own published technical documentation, tamper-proof against external intrusion. "External intrusion," Kira said, with the flatness of someone who has found an elegant error in someone else's work. Their hardening is comprehensive against intrusion from outside the network. It's not hardened against resonance feedback propagated from within the network through the network's own internal communication channels, because the Veld administrative designers didn't consider the possibility that someone inside the network would want to break it. "Why not?" Marin asked. Kira looked at her. The look was not unkind, but it had the quality of someone who is patient with questions that are obvious once you have the answer. "Because the Veld have never built a system that their own population wanted to break," she said. "They don't have internal dissent as a variable. They're not built for it, culturally, neurologically. The concept of a population turning its infrastructure against itself is genuinely outside their modeling. They've never needed to model it." The room was quiet for a moment, and "We have," Marin said. "We've been doing nothing but that for 17 years, Kira said. This, Marin thought, typing the observation into her notes with the deliberateness she reserved for things that mattered, was the most strategically important thing she had heard since the occupation began. She spent 3 days in the Hollow. She interviewed 47 people. She recorded everything. The Hollow's population was approximately 8,000. Fisher's ongoing count put it at 8,300 and change, with new arrivals most weeks, spread across what had once been 12 city blocks of residential and light commercial space. They were mostly young, mostly formerly middle classification, mostly people who had done everything the consortium's administrative structure required of them, filed their labor availability forms, attended their classification reviews, paid their care debts on the schedule, and who had arrived anyway at the point where the math stopped working. The math always eventually stopped working, because it had been designed to. The debt service structure was the mechanism. Marin had documented it before in fragmentary form from individual cases, from data pulled from public administrative filings. Being in the Hollow was the first time she had access to enough cases simultaneously to see it, as the system it was rather than as a series of individual misfortunes. The consortium's care cost structure charged human classified individuals for the medical care of their dependents at a rate that exceeded what the labor classification system made it possible to earn. Not by a small margin, by a calculated margin. The gap was precisely wide enough that a diligent worker who did everything right, who never made a financial mistake, who was never unlucky, would arrive at their mid-30s with a debt burden that had been mathematically irreversible since they were approximately 22. At that point, the classification system's interest accrual mechanisms took over, and the rest of the arc was set. You could not pay it off. You were not intended to pay it off. You were intended to service it indefinitely. generating consortium administrative revenue until you died, whereupon the debt transferred to your children and the cycle began again. Marin put the word designed in her notes, underlined, 3 times. She interviewed a woman named Dana E., who had been a school teacher. She interviewed a man named Ruben, who had been a structural engineer. She interviewed a pair of brothers who had been, respectively, a translator and a chef, and who had been inseparable since childhood in ways that the consortium's labor classification system had treated as irrelevant and which were, it turned out, the central fact of both their lives. She interviewed elderly people and middle-aged people, and people who were barely 20, who had grown up in the hollow and known nothing else, and were building the water reclamation system's secondary filtration stage with the focused expertise of people who had learned their engineering from the previous generation of people who had had to figure it out themselves. She interviewed Fisher late at night, after the rest of the hollow was as quiet as a place with 8,000 people ever gets. He was updating his list. It was a physical list, actual paper, an affectation he'd held on to from a time before digital records were exclusively consortium-controlled, and which had turned out to be not an affectation at all but a considered choice. The consortium cannot pull a paper record from a database, he said when she asked about it. They can take the paper from me, but they'd have to be here to do it, and if they're here, I'll know. How many names are on it? He turned the list to show her. 812 names in his cramped, precise handwriting with dates and in some cases brief notations she didn't ask him to decode. 812, she said. 812 people who were going to be consumed by the administrative architecture and found somewhere else to go instead, he said. That's what this list is. It's evidence that the something else to go is possible. You know they'll come eventually, Marin said. She said this not to frighten him, but because she had been reporting on the consortium long enough to understand that the Hollow's continued existence was a calculated risk on their part, and that risk calculations changed when variables changed. I know, he said. When Kira's system is operational, when it works, the variable will change, Marin said. They'll come faster. Fisher looked at his list. He smoothed the top edge of the paper with his thumb, a gesture that seemed unconscious. Then I'll have done what I could, he said. That's all any of us get. You do what you can with the position you have, and you try to make sure it meant something. He poured her a cup of the Hollow's reconstituted tea, which was made from ingredients she couldn't identify and didn't ask about. She drank it. It was terrible, and it was warm, and it was given freely, and in the Hollow, freely given warmth had a specific weight to it. Tell me why you started, she said. Fisher was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, my daughter, he said. She was 23. Her debt classification hit the irreversible threshold the year I started working in the upper floors. I watched the system do exactly what it was designed to do to her. I watched her face the day she understood that there was no legitimate path out. The expression on it. He paused. She didn't stay. She found her own way out. He said this with careful, deliberate vagueness, and Marin understood what it meant and did not ask him to clarify. I decided that if I could do one thing with the position I had, one thing, it would be to make sure that no one else's face had to look like that there was always a door. Marin sat with that for a while. I'm going to publish all of this, she said. The system documentation, the testimonies, the technical analysis, everything, including you, unless you tell me not to. He looked at her. The lamp between them lit his face from below, casting the shadows upward in a way that made him look older than he was. If you publish it, they'll move faster, he said. Yes. If you don't publish it, the system continues, he said, and people who don't know there's a door keep not knowing. Yes, he refilled her cup. Then publish it, he said. She left the Hollow on the 4th morning. Sophie and Eli walked her to the tunnel entrance. The two of them close together in the particular way of people who have spent time apart and are still persuading themselves that the reunion is real and permanent. Eli looked different from the man in the documentary broadcasts. Harder in some planes of his face, more settled in others, as though the weight of the months he'd spent in the Hollow, months of having to figure things out from nothing, months of being useful in ways that had nothing to do with how he'd defined his value before, had compressed him into something denser and more stable. What do you want people to know? Marin asked him at the hatch. He thought about it. This was something she'd noticed about the people in the Hollow. The seriousness of thought. The circumstances had stripped away the habitual evasiveness that comfortable living allows, and what remained was directness. He wasn't performing an answer for her recorder. He was actually deciding what he wanted to say. I want them to know it's not shameful, he said. The breaking point. The moment when the math stops working and you have nothing left. That's not evidence of personal failure. The system is designed, he used the word the way Fisher used it, with the flat precision of someone who has thought it through to bring you to that point and then make you believe the breaking is yours. Your fault, your weakness, your inadequacy. He paused. It isn't. And there's somewhere to go. Sophie squeezed his hand. He squeezed back without looking at her. Tell them that, Marin said. On record, he looked at her recorder. He had the expression of someone who had spent 30 years in front of cameras and had never fully resolved their relationship with it. The Millennium Program had followed him from birth, and being documented was the oldest fact of his life, and he still wasn't comfortable with it, which had always been the most human thing about him. Then he looked at Sophie, who gave him a very small nod. All right, he said, and looked back at the recorder and said it again clearly for the record. Marin published the documentation 8 days later. She'd spent those 8 days working with a care she hadn't applied to anything in years, structuring evidence, cross-referencing Kira's technical analysis of the node network with Fisher's administrative records, with the testimony of 47 Hollow residents with the consortium's own publicly available administrative data, which she'd been compiling for 6 years precisely against a use like this. She layered it. She built the case from the ground up so that any individual component could be challenged and the structure would still stand, because she'd been doing this long enough to know that the consortium's response to documentation was always first to attack the weakest source, and she was determined not to have a weakest source. The publication went out simultaneously across 14 back-channel relays, 3 compromised consortium information nodes she'd had access to for 2 years, and held in reserve for exactly this kind of moment, and in a decision that felt simultaneously reckless and perfectly calibrated, the consortium's own emergency broadcast frequency, accessed through a routing vulnerability she'd identified 18 months ago, and mentioned to no one, not even her source. She hit the transmission key alone. At 4:30 in the morning, with a cup of actual coffee she'd been saving for an occasion significant enough to justify it. For 93 seconds, every screen in sectors 1 through 12 showed Eli Dresch's face and his voice. It's not shameful. It's not something you did wrong. The system is designed to bring you to that point and then make you believe the breaking is yours. It isn't, and there's somewhere to go. Then the consortium signal management system identified the intrusion and shut it down. 93 seconds was enough. She was in the relay station, composing the second stage of her transmission strategy, when the door opened and Fabian walked in without knocking, which meant it was an emergency or it was Fabian. The back channels are lit up, he said. All of them. People are asking questions. Good. Fisher is asking when you think the enforcement response will come. Marin looked at her monitoring feeds. The consortium's administrative communications were showing elevated internal traffic, which she couldn't fully intercept, but could measure volumetrically. The volume had jumped in the 40 minutes since the broadcast. 48 to 72 hours, she said. They'll want to assess the scope first, document what they think they know. They're not reactive. They're systematic. The Hollow needs time, I know. She was already composing the alert to her source, the single line of innocuous-seeming text that meant, prepare a data package and hold Marin. Fabienne sat in the second chair, the one she kept for people who came to tell her things that needed chairs. If they arrest Fisher, his records are already distributed, she said. I made copies before I left. The list exists in 7 locations. If they take him, the list survives. Fabian nodded slowly. And Kirkra's system, if it works, she paused. If it works, it changes what the Hollow is, not just a place to hide. An active variable in the administrative equation. That's when this gets serious. It's already serious, he said. It gets more serious, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Are you afraid? She considered the question with the honesty she tried to apply to everything she documented. Yes, she said. I'm always afraid. I've been afraid since I was 12 years old and the sky turned wrong. And I've been working anyway because the alternative is watching without recording, and watching without recording feels like complicity. She paused. Are you? Yes, he said. But I've also been afraid this whole time, and the Hollow is the first thing I've seen in 17 years that feels like he searched for the word, like people being themselves again, rather than being what the system requires them to be. She looked at him for a moment. Write that down, she said. I want to use it. The consortium's response took 3 days to materialize, which was faster than Marin had expected. Their public information service issued a statement characterizing the Hollow as an unsanctioned habitation, zone hosting criminal registry falsification infrastructure, and individuals in non-compliant administrative status. Their enforcement units were ordered to enter Residual Zone 14 to restore registry compliance. The administrative language was careful and bureaucratic and meant, translated plainly, they were coming for Fisher. Marin received the intelligence from her source 24 hours before the deployment was scheduled. She relayed it to the Hollow through the back channels, which were already burning with traffic. People from 16 sectors who had seen the broadcast read the documentation were asking questions they hadn't known to ask before. She spent the hours before dawn, the night before the deployment, writing, because writing was the thing she knew how to do. That was also the thing that mattered. She wrote the second part of the documentation, the part about what the Hollow was, the part about what people built when they had only time and each other, and the irreducible human need to make things mean something. She wrote about the library. She wrote about the school. She wrote about the water reclamation system, built from other people's discarded administrative infrastructure. She wrote about Fisher's list and what it meant to have a list. She wrote about Eli Dresch at the workbench, humming something under his breath while he worked, and Sophie hearing it and knowing what it meant, and how that was the detail that lived in her mind more than any of the technical specifications or administrative data, because it was the thing the consortium's architecture had no frame for and no response to. She saved the file. She sent it to 7 locations. Then she went to the Hollow to be there when the deployment arrived. The enforcement deployment entered residual zone 14 at dawn, through the primary checkpoint, in 3 vehicles with consortium insignia. 12 administrative enforcement officers, moving with the practiced efficiency of a unit that handled routine compliance operations. And behind them, something less routine, a Veld administrative supervisor, an actual Veld present in a human residential zone, which was unusual enough that Marin felt the specific anxiety she'd learned to identify as the sensation of a situation entering territory with no established precedent. The Veld were tall. That was the thing photographs didn't adequately convey. Over 2 meters, moving with the fluid economy of creatures for whom physical effort had been optimized away over evolutionary and technological timespans that dwarfed human civilization. Their features were planed and flat, their sensory organs arranged in configurations that human neurology found subtly wrong to look at for extended periods. Their skin held the morning light differently than human skin, not reflecting it but absorbing and emitting it at a slightly different wavelength so that they seemed to generate their own faint illumination. The supervisor walked behind the enforcement officers with the unhurried confidence of something that had never had a reason to hurry, because everything it needed had always arrived on schedule. Fisher was at his station. He was not hiding, and he had not attempted to leave. Fabian had offered him 3 different routes out of the Hollow through the tunnel network. Fisher had listened carefully, thanked him, and declined. He had spent the 3 days since the intelligence arrived doing what he did every day. Processing arrivals, updating his list, making tea, sitting up late with people who needed someone to sit with them. The night before the deployment he had organized his records, made clean copies, confirmed with Fabian that the distribution was complete. He had drunk his last cup of bad tea with the patient finality of someone who is saying goodbye to a routine they intend to carry forward in whatever comes next. "You don't have to," Fabian said in the morning. "No," Fisher said. "I think I do." He went out to meet the deployment in the open corridor between the laundry station and the water reclamation system in the early gray light, with his hands loose at his sides, and the specific quality of someone who has made a decision they've examined from every angle and found finally acceptable. The Veld supervisor stopped 6 meters from him. The enforcement officers fanned out. The Hollow's residents, who had been warned the night before and had spent the night deciding collectively what to do about it, were visible in the corridors and on the elevated walkways, present and watching. The supervisor spoke through its translation device. "You are Fisher. You have been operating an unauthorized registry falsification system and harboring individuals classified as deceased by administrative registry." "Yes," Fisher said. "You will comply with administrative detention." Fisher reached into his coat and produced his list. He held it out toward the supervisor, not handing it over, just showing it. 812 names, he said. "These are people who were going to be consumed by the administrative cost structure. Not killed, not imprisoned, just processed and processed until there was nothing left of them, and the processing continued on their children. I gave them somewhere else to go." He looked at the supervisor steadily. He was not performing bravery. He was just very clear about what he had done and why. "Every name on this list is a person who should not have had to disappear to survive. I'd do it again." The supervisor looked at the list. Marin, watching through Fabian's relay camera from a position 3 corridors back, couldn't read the Veld's expression. She'd spent years learning what she could of Veld body language, and she'd learned enough to know there were registers of it she simply couldn't access, the internal states that had no human analog and no external signal she could interpret. But she could see that the supervisor looked at the list for longer than was necessary for a routine compliance assessment. Then it gestured to the enforcement officers. They moved, and Kira's system came online. The cascade took 11 seconds. Marin had timed it afterward from the relay recording, playing it back frame by frame. 11 seconds from activation to the moment every node in residual zone 14 processed its own internal resonance feedback through its own safety cutoff architecture and went offline. Not destroyed, not damaged, simply elegantly offline. Their own design turned briefly against itself by a signal that had traveled through the consortium's own network infrastructure using the consortium's own communication protocols. The nodes had done exactly what they were designed to do when exposed to the precise frequency Kira had spent months calculating. They had protected themselves from overload by shutting themselves down. In the silence after the cascade, the enforcement officers' communication links were offline. Their location tracking was offline. The consortium administrative supervisor's connection to its remote support infrastructure was offline. The deployment was present, operational in the physical sense, and completely isolated from the administrative architecture that gave it its authority and its context. In the sudden quiet, the Hollow came outside. Not with weapons, there were almost no weapons in the Hollow, a choice that had been made early and maintained deliberately, because Kira had once explained to anyone who would listen that a population perceived as an armed threat received a very different administrative response than a population perceived as an administrative anomaly. Not with anger, not with barricades, not with any of the grammar of confrontation that the enforcement unit's training covered. They came out the way people come to look at something unexpected in the sky. Curious, present, occupying space as a natural fact. 8,300 people. On the walkways, on the reclamation system scaffolding in the corridors. Standing on the rooftops of the improvised structures they'd built over months of collective problem solving. Filling the open areas. Looking, not at the enforcement officers, primarily, at the Veld supervisor. The supervisor stood in the center of this and did what Veld did when their administrative framework had no applicable response. It went very still. The enforcement officers grouped around it. They had been trained for human resistance that had a recognizable shape: violence, flight, aggression, barricade. No one had trained them for 8,000 people, simply standing in open air and watching with the specific quality of people who have stopped being afraid. Fisher stood in the same spot he'd been standing when the cascade began. His list was in his hand. He hadn't moved. "You could still take me," he said to the supervisor. His voice carried clearly in the offline silence. "I'm not stopping you." The supervisor looked at him. It looked at the list. It looked at the people on the walkways and in the corridors and on the rooftops, all of them looking back. Marin could not read its expression. She had her recorder running. She had her hand on it, steady, because her hands had learned over years not to shake when they were recording. "What do you want?" the supervisor said. It was the first time Marin had heard a Veld administrator ask a human being what they wanted. Not what their classification required them to want. Not what their administrative compliance demanded. What they, as people, actually wanted. Fisher thought about it. He did not rush. "I want you to look at this list," he said. "Not as administrative data, not as evidence in a compliance case. I want you to hold it and understand that every name on it is a person who should not have had to disappear to survive. That there is something wrong with the system that makes disappearing the only available exit." He paused. "I want you to take that back to whoever designed your care cost architecture and tell them what it produced. And then I want you to leave." The supervisor looked at the list for a long time. Then it reached out and took it. Not processed it, not cataloged it, not inputted it into an administrative system. Took it in the way that a person takes something they intend to hold. The deployment withdrew. What happened next was not a moment. This was the thing that Marin spent months trying to articulate in her documentation and never quite got, right to her own satisfaction. It was not a moment, not a victory in the cinematic sense, not a before and after. It was a process, slow, partial, uneven, constantly in danger of reversal. Real. The nodes came back online 40 minutes after the deployment withdrew. Partially. Some functions restored, others not. The ones that weren't restored were the ones whose safety cutoffs had been triggered by Kira's resonance feedback, which meant the consortium's technical teams needed to examine their architectural assumptions from an angle they'd never examined them from before. Significant time. The Veld's administrative systems were very good at many things, and examining their own architectural assumptions from the inside was not one of them. It would take a while. That was fine. The back-channel traffic exploded. Not just comment on what had happened in the Hollow, though there was plenty of that. People in 12 sectors sharing the documentation, asking questions, saying in message after message some version of "I thought it was my fault," but something more constructive. People asking how the water reclamation system had been built. People asking how Fisher's processing procedure worked, whether it could be replicated. People asking Kira through relays technical questions about the resonance feedback approach. Kira answering when she could, in the terse accurate prose of someone who was more comfortable with schematics than sentences, but who understood why the sentences mattered. It was not justice. Marin said this clearly in everything she published in the weeks that followed, because she had been a journalist long enough to know that hope that outruns its evidence is a trap, and the Hollow's 8,000 residents deserved accurate hope, not inflated hope. The structural review the consortium issued 2 weeks after the deployment's withdrawal. The first formal acknowledgement that something in the cost architecture was a structural rather than a population compliance issue was not justice. It was 2 amended allocation tables and 3 under-implementation task groups, and a change in administrative language that was nevertheless a change. Administrative language change in consortium communication was close to acknowledgement. It was the first step on a very long road. Marin documented it, labeled it accurately, and kept working. Sophie found Eli in the workshop the evening of the withdrawal. He was back at Kira's workbench, not because of urgency, the immediate crisis had passed, but because he'd found in the weeks in the Hollow that his hands needed occupation. That purposeful work was not a distraction from the larger situation, but was somehow part of how he processed the larger situation. He was working on a secondary coupling for Kira's second array, translating her schematic into components with the absorbed attention she'd taught him. Sophie sat beside him, not at the workbench, on a chair she pulled up close. She didn't touch him. She just sat. "You should have told me," she said after a while. "I know. When the debt started, when the contract ended, any of those times, I know." He kept his hands on the component he was working on. Not defensive, just honest. "It felt like my failure. I know that's what it was designed to feel like. But that's what it felt like. I couldn't show you the thing I'd become when I had nothing. I needed to find the way back first." "You thought I'd leave," Sophie said. Not accusingly, diagnosing. He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you'd pity me," he said, which might have been worse. Sophie was quiet. "Your mother's song," she said. He looked at her. "When we were 14, on the documentary. There was an episode when your grandmother got sick and they filmed you at the hospital. You were in the waiting room for 6 hours. You spent most of it staring at the floor, but there were 2 or 3 moments when you didn't know the camera was there, or you'd forgotten, and you were humming something very quietly." She paused. "I recognized it from a different episode. When you were 8, your mother was putting you to bed and she was singing something and you fell asleep and they kept the camera on you because you looked so." She paused again, "because you looked exactly the way a person should look when they're safe." He had stopped working. His hands were still. "When they brought you out of the hospital and I got to you," Sophie said, "I could hear you humming before I reached you. Across the room, the same song." She looked at him. "I knew you were all right before you even opened your eyes." He was quiet for a long time. "She used to sing it when I was small," he said. "I didn't know I still did it. You do." He set the component down carefully. He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any of the gestures the documentary program had always tried to frame as narrative beats. Just took it, because it was there and it was hers. Outside, in the Hollow's corridors, someone was playing a stringed instrument, something that didn't resolve into any genre Marin could have categorized, but that carried the specific quality of music made by people who are not performing for anyone. People who are playing because the playing itself is the thing. The sound came through the workshop walls, faint and warm. Eli listened to it for a moment, and then very quietly began to hum. Marin published the full documentation 6 months later. She called it The Hollow. It was the longest thing she'd ever written, the most carefully sourced, the most deliberately structured. It covered the care cost architecture in full, the compounding interest mechanisms, the debt transfer clauses, the labor classification gap that made the math irreversible by design. It covered the node network's architectural vulnerability from Kira's technical analysis, which she published in full because she believed that information being in the world was better than information being in the consortium's exclusive possession. It covered Fisher, his history, his 812 names, his daughter, The decision he'd made in a hospital corridor watching a system do what it was designed to do to someone he loved. It covered the Hollow, its 8,000 inhabitants, its water reclamation system, its medical station, improvised library organized not by subject but by what the books had meant, its school in a storage bay, its music in the corridors at night. It covered what people built when they had nothing but time and each other, and the specifically human inability to stop making things and meaning things. It covered the Veld supervisor standing in the morning corridor with Fisher's list in its hands. In the opening, before the first chapter, she included one epigraph. She'd written it herself from Fisher's words, with his permission. The system is designed to bring you to your breaking point and then make you believe the failure is yours. The failure is not yours. The breaking point is where you find the door. The documentation was read in the year following publication by more people than had read anything she'd produced in 6 years combined. She received messages from 19 other sectors. 16 of them described conditions structurally identical to the ones she'd documented. 3 mentioned that they had places, unnamed, informal, not yet the size of the Hollow, where people who hit their breaking points went when they needed somewhere to go. She wrote back to all of them. The second deployment came 4 months after the documentation's publication. Larger, 24 enforcement officers, 2 Veld supervisors, an administrative assessment team with evaluation hardware. They were there, according to the intelligence Marin received from her source the day before, not primarily to arrest Fisher. His status had been complicated by the structural review into something the administrative system hadn't quite decided how to classify, but to conduct a comprehensive survey of the Hollow's infrastructure with a view to integration into standard registry management, which meant the consortium wanted to know how it worked, which meant the Hollow had entered their modeling as a variable rather than an anomaly. Marin told Kira this. Kira received it with the expressionless focus she brought to all new information. They want to study it, Marin said. They want to understand how it's sustainable, Kira said, because it shouldn't be, by their models. Will you let them? Kira picked up Marin's charge pack. She'd brought it because Fabian mentioned the relay was low and connected it to the array relay. The array hummed to life. I'll let them study the infrastructure, Kira said. And while they're studying it, I'll study how they study it. Because the way they observe a system tells you what their model of the system is. And once you know their model, you know what they can't see. She said this with the complete practicality of someone whose entire operational framework was built on understanding what tools were actually doing, not what they were supposed to do. And what can't they see? Marin asked. Kira looked at her with the patience she reserved for questions whose answers were obvious from inside the frame she worked in. Why it matters, she said. They can model the water reclamation output. They can't model why we built it. Those are different things. The assessment team spent 4 days in the Hollow. They moved through it systematically with their evaluation equipment, measuring, recording, cataloging. The Hollow's residents watched them with the attention of people who have been documented and assessed their entire lives and have learned to be observed without being diminished by it. On the 3rd day, one of the assessment team members, younger than the others, though Marin had never been certain she could accurately assess Veld age, stopped in front of the library. She had described the library in the documentation. The 400 physical texts, the organizational system built on meaning rather than subject, the fact that it had been built from whatever people brought with them and traded for, so that it contained a manual on pipe fitting next to a collection of equations next to a novel. Someone had carried across 3 checkpoints in a coat lining next to a child's picture book that a woman named Lotta kept because her daughter had loved it, and her daughter was in a different sector, and the book was what she had. The assessment team member stood in front of this and was still in the Veld way. Then it turned to the young woman sitting on the bench nearby. 20 years old, dark-haired, born in the Hollow, educated in its improvised school by 12 adults with different skills and a great deal of collective dedication, and spoke through its translation device. What is the organizational logic of this collection? The young woman considered the question with the seriousness of someone who had learned that questions deserved serious answers. It's organized by what things meant, she said, not what they're about, what they meant to the person who last read them. Those are different things. The assessment team member looked at her. It looked back at the library. We do not have an analog for this categorization system, it said. No, the young woman said pleasantly without any drama, the way you'd say something obvious to someone who has only just noticed it. I didn't think you did. Marin included the library in the documentation's 3rd section, and she did not editorialize. She let the exchange stand as she'd recorded it, because it didn't need her interpretation. The most important things rarely did. She had been trying, for months, to articulate the specific thing the Hollow represented that was different from the kind of human resistance the Veld's administrative systems were designed to manage. It wasn't military resistance. The Hollow had almost no weapons. It wasn't economic resistance. The Hollow was, by any standard metric, economically marginal. It wasn't political resistance in any formal sense. The Hollow had no government, no charter, no elected representatives. It wasn't even the interference system, as significant as that had been. It was the library organized by what things meant. The Veld were, by any measurable, documentable standard, more advanced than humanity. Their technology was superior. Their administrative systems were more efficient. Their lifespan was longer, their cognitive processing faster, their physical capabilities broadly superior in most categories Marin could assess. She had never found the versions of human resistance that leaned on martial ability or individual heroics very honest, and she hadn't written that kind of documentation. The truth was that humanity had lost, in the conventional sense, when the Veld arrived. What humanity had not lost, and what the Veld, for all their efficiency, had genuinely not accounted for in their administrative architecture, was the need to mean something to each other. The library organized by meaning rather than subject. The terrible tea given freely. The music in the corridors at night. Eli humming his mother's song. Fisher's list, 812 names, each one a person who should not have had to disappear to survive. The cargo hauler named Orla, who had sat with a bleeding stranger on a public concourse for 43 minutes because someone had to. This was not a quality the consortium had modeled. It had no administrative classification, no labor registry entry, no credit value. You could not tax it or regulate it or build a system that contained it because it was not at root a material thing. It was the specific human determination to be witnessed by each other, to matter to each other, to carry each other in ways that had no quantification and required no justification. The Veld supervisor had taken Fisher's list. Marin kept thinking about this. A Veld administrator, receiving 812 names from a tired human medic in a condemned residential zone and taking it, not filing it as administrative data. Taking it. She didn't know what it meant. She did not know if it meant anything. She was a journalist. She documented what was there, but she kept thinking about it. On the first anniversary of the Hollow's publication, Marin went back. Fabian met her at the tunnel hatch. He looked better, less worn. The quality of underground survival, slightly eased by the months since the structural review and the assessment team's visit, which had produced a second working group and 2 more amended allocation tables, none of which were justice and all of which were better than nothing, and better than nothing in a direction that kept trending. The Hollow had grown, 11,400 Fisher's current count, new water reclamation sections, a second medical station, 2 more wings of the library, the school now teaching 3 sessions daily in 2 rooms. There were 6 other Hollows in other sectors that Marin was in regular contact with, each building its own version of what the original had built, adapted to its own conditions. Fisher was at his station. The list was now 1,200 names, both sides of the page. Kira was teaching. 3 new apprentices this time, watching her trace a resonance diagram on the whiteboard with the absorbed attention of people who have found the thing they were supposed to be doing. Teaching was, it turned out, another thing Kira was better at than anyone had expected, because the same quality of mind that saw what a system was actually doing could also see exactly what a student didn't yet understand and go to that point directly. Eli was at the workbench. Sophie was at a table with a tablet and a set of financial records, mapping debt structures with the focused precision of someone applying genuine expertise to the specific problem of understanding exactly where the administrative architecture was designed to be inescapable rather than merely hard. She was good at this. She was better at this than she'd been at anything in her previous professional life, because the stakes were real and the people were real, and the distance between the analysis and the outcome was 0. When Marin came in, Eli looked up. He gave her the half-smile, his mother's eyes, his father's jaw, the expression of someone who has stopped trying not to show that something matters. "You look terrible," he said. "How long have you been working?" 18 hours. Sit down. I'm fine. You're not fine. He was already at the supply shelf. "We have tea. I've had your tea. It's an acquired taste. It's a terrible taste. It's warm," he said, "and it's here," and he handed her the cup. She sat. She held the cup with both hands and let the warmth come through. Outside, the music was playing again, the stringed instrument, the rhythm that didn't resolve into any genre, the sound of people making something because the making was itself the point. She thought about Fisher's list. She thought about the library. She thought about the young woman telling the assessment team member that the books were organized by what they meant, and the long-veiled silence that followed. She thought about Orla sitting with a bleeding stranger on a public concourse for 43 minutes because someone had to. She thought about her source, who had been passing her data for 4 years and had never asked for anything in return except that she be careful. She thought about the message her source had sent 2 days ago. Second review initiated, broader scope. She thought about what it meant to begin, that it meant small, precise things, that it meant a charge pack carried because someone mentioned a relay running low, that it meant a list updated to include both sides of the page, that it meant a cup of tea, warm and terrible, given in the dark. The Veld had never built a system their own population wanted to break. They had no frame for it. They had no variable in their administrative modeling for the thing that made humans, 17 years into an occupation that had taken everything they had, still be here making music in condemned corridors and organizing libraries by what things meant and sitting with strangers on public concourses because someone had to. That wasn't a weapon. It didn't win battles in the military sense, and Marin had never claimed it did. But it was the thing the consortium had no variable for, no classification for, no administrative response to. And administrative systems without a variable for a force eventually meet that force in a way that requires them to update their assumptions. The Veld supervisor had taken the list. A Veld administrator had asked a human being what they wanted. An assessment team had stood in front of a library organized by meaning and gone still, not victory. A beginning. The crack in the wall that lets the light in, not the wall coming down. Marin drank the terrible tea. She picked up her recorder. She went back to work. There were things Marin had documented in the hollow that had surprised her, and things that hadn't. The surprise was not where she expected it. She had expected the resilience. Journalism in occupied sectors had given her an extensive catalog of human resilience in conditions of privation and constraint. She documented it in Sector 3 when the water allocation dropped below survivable levels, and the residents invented a distribution system in 48 hours using materials the consortium had classified as waste. She documented it in Sector 7 when the medical classification caps hit, and 4 nurses began training their neighbors in basic care protocols. In a series of evening sessions in a building no one officially admitted to using. Human beings subjected to impossible conditions had, in Marin's experience, a deep and not always rational tendency to refuse to accept that the conditions were impossible. This was not always effective. It was always real. What surprised her was how funny they were. Not in a desperate way, not in the gallows humor mode of people laughing to keep from crying. Though there was that too, because there would always be that. In a genuine way. The water reclamation engineers had named their secondary filtration stage the bureaucrat because it processed things very slowly but with great administrative thoroughness. The Hollow's improvised school was called the Academy, with a deliberate capital A and a collective dry awareness that the capital A was doing a great deal of work. Fisher was referred to by his own staff affectionately as the Registrar, which was a consortium administrative title, deployed here with the specific irony of a title that meant the opposite of what it usually meant. The consortium doesn't have humor. Kira told Marin in one of their late working sessions when Marin mentioned this observation. Not as a social function. They have something that performs a similar role neurologically, a response to incongruity, but it's not used communally. It's not a bonding mechanism. How do you know this? I've spent months studying their administrative node architecture, Kira said. The way a system is built tells you what the builders valued. Their systems are optimized for efficiency, accuracy, and consistency. There's no provision in the communication architecture for content that is intentionally inconsistent with stated meaning. Irony breaks their parsing. She paused. I didn't realize this was a meaningful tactical fact until about 3 months ago. Marin looked at her steadily. Are you saying that humans' ability to communicate ironically is a strategic asset? I'm saying their inability to parse it reliably is a strategic liability they've never needed to account for, Kira said. Which is different, but functionally similar, yes. Marin wrote this down. She labeled it provisional. Everything Kira said that she couldn't independently verify, she labeled provisional, though Kira's provisional track record was better than most people's confirmed, and she cross-referenced it with 3 separate documented instances of Veld administrative responses to human communications that had contained embedded irony, none of which the responding consortium officers had identified as ironic. It held up. She published it 6 weeks later as a technical appendix to the Hollow's 2nd edition. It generated more back-channel response than any other section of the documentation. including the care cost analysis, which she had expected to be the central gravity of it. People wanted to talk about the irony. People sent her examples. The back-channel feeds were, briefly, full of humans cataloging every time they'd said something to a Veld administrator that meant two things, and the administrator had responded to only one of them. It became something. She wasn't sure yet what. She was documenting it. The third time Marin met her source in person was 6 months after the Hollow's first anniversary. They met in the maintenance tunnels under Sector 9, in a junction that was noisy enough from the infrastructure above to defeat most monitoring systems, with two of Fabian's people maintaining watch at the corridor intersections. Her source was a human. This surprised some people when they learned of the source's existence, because they assumed a source inside the consortium's administrative communications had to be Veld, but the consortium ran a significant human staff at the upper administrative levels. For the same reason, they maintained human designers and human medics and human engineers. There were specific tasks that required human cognitive architecture, and the consortium was not ideologically opposed to using what worked. What it was opposed to was human administrative staff with agendas of their own. The assumption that this opposition was effectively enforced was the error. Her source's name was Adria. She was 40 years old, maintained a senior administrative translation position that gave her read access to most of the internal communications Marin needed, and had been passing data for 4 years for a reason, she explained, the first time they met in person, with characteristic brevity. My brother, she said, depth classification hit threshold when he was 28. He didn't find a Fisher. She paused. I took the position 6 months later. Marin hadn't asked what had happened to the brother. She didn't need to. Now Adria handed her a data chip, with the careful, habituated casualness of someone who had been transferring information in small spaces for years. The second review, she said. Broader scope than the first. They've expanded the terms of reference to include labor registry design. Labor registry, Marin said. The labor registry was the upstream mechanism, the classification system that determined what work humans could perform at what rate under what conditions. It was the architecture the debt system sat on. Reviewing it was either a genuine reckoning with how the whole system was designed or a bureaucratic maneuver to appear to be having that reckoning without actually having it. I can't tell you which, Adria said, reading her expression. What I can tell you is that the supervisor who took Fisher's list is on the review committee. Marin held this. The same supervisor. The same supervisor. She looked at the data chip in her hand. She thought about the list. 812 names. The supervisor who had taken it carried it away in its own hands rather than processing it as administrative data. What do you think it means? She asked. Audra was quiet for a moment. She had the quality of a person who had spent years inside a system they opposed and had learned to make very precise distinctions between what they observed and what they inferred. I think, she said carefully, that there are things the Veld administrative architects did not account for when they built the occupation's social infrastructure. I think the list was one of them. I think the Hollow was one of them. She paused. I think they built a system optimized for efficiency, and they are now encountering the consequences of a variable they did not model. The variable being that humans do not stop mattering to each other, Adria said, when it becomes administratively inconvenient for them to do so. Marin published the contents of the second review, what she could verify from the data chip, what she could independently corroborate from public administrative filings, what Kira could extrapolate from the node network's operational patterns, in 2 stages over 3 weeks. She was careful with it. The careful journalism was the kind that held up after the story moved on, and she was building something she wanted to hold up. The first stage was the technical review of the labor registry design. The mathematical demonstration which Kira had helped her build, that the gap between classifiable labor output and debt service requirement was not a miscalculation but a structural feature. That it had been that way from the registry's implementation. That it could not have been that way accidentally, given the precision of the consortium's administrative engineering in every other aspect of the system. That it had been designed. The second stage was the review committee's composition, which included the Veld supervisor who had taken Fisher's list. The back-channel response was different from the previous publications. Not louder exactly, but different in quality. Less the sound of people discovering something for the first time, and more the sound of people who had suspected something for years receiving confirmation. The confirmation changed things differently than discovery did. Discovery could be disputed as speculation, as conspiracy, as the misreading of coincidence. Confirmation built on documented evidence was harder to categorize as anything other than what it was. There were protests. Not in the Hollow. The Hollow was not that kind of place. Its politics were the politics of building things rather than of confronting things, which was a distinction Marin had come to think was actually strategic rather than passive. In Sectors 3 and 7 and 11, in the overcrowded corridors of lower-floor hospitals, on the public concourses that enforcement units tried to clear and could not clear fast enough to prevent people from standing there long enough to be seen. People standing on public concourses. Not barricades, not violence, not in numbers that required military response. Just present, occupying space as a natural fact, looking. The consortium's enforcement response was calibrated and controlled and produced exactly the imagery Marin had expected, because the consortium was systematic about enforcement, and systems were predictable once you understood them. She documented the response with the same care she documented everything else. She sent it out across the channels. She watched it move. Fisher came to find her the week after the second publication. This surprised her. He was not a person who sought people out ordinarily. He was a person who stayed in one place and let the people who needed him find their way there. He came to her relay station in the afternoon, knocked with the specific rhythm she recognized from the tunnel network's coded knocks, and came in when she opened the door. He looked tired. He had looked tired for the entire time she'd known him, but this was different. Not the bone-deep exhaustion of someone overextended, but the lighter fatigue of someone who has been carrying a thing for a long time and has recently become aware that they might eventually be able to put it down. He sat in the chair across from her. He put a folded piece of paper on the table between them. "The list," he said. "I made a copy before the supervisor took it. I've been keeping the copy current." He looked at the paper. "There are 1,247 names on it now." Marin looked at the paper. She didn't touch it. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Because I want you to understand something about the number," he said. "Not the scale of it, the composition." He unfolded the paper. The handwriting inside was dense, practiced. "In the beginning, the people who came to me were at the absolute bottom. The debt threshold breach, the full crisis, nothing left. There was no other exit. In the last 6 months, I've had people come to me who were not at the absolute bottom. People who were at the point where they could see the bottom coming and who decided, before they hit it, that they wanted to choose a different direction." He looked up from the paper. "That's different. That used to not happen." Marin understood what he was telling her. "They know there's a door," she said. "They know before they're desperate," Fisher said. "That's different from knowing when you're desperate. When you're desperate, the door is an exit. When you know before, the door is a choice." He folded the paper again. "The documentation did that. The broadcast did that." He looked at her. "You did that." She started to say something modest about collective effort and the Hollow's own existence and Kira's technical work, all of which was true, and Fisher made a small gesture that stopped her. "I'm not diminishing any of that," he said. "I'm telling you specifically that the thing you do, making it visible, making it legible, making it something people can hold and understand rather than just endure, that changed the nature of what the door was. That matters." He stood. He put the copy of the list back in his coat. "I thought you should know," he said. He left. She sat with it for a while. Then she picked up her recorder and started composing the next section of the documentation she'd been building, the one about what happened when people knew the door existed before they were desperate, about the difference between an exit and a choice, about what it meant that the number was 1,247, and growing, and included people who had not yet hit the absolute bottom and were choosing differently anyway. The second review committee issued its preliminary findings 14 months after the Hollow's original publication. The findings were long and carefully worded and contained, buried in the third section, a sentence that Marin read 4 times before she trusted her own reading of it. The sentence acknowledged, in the consortium's administrative language, that the labor classification system's current design parameters produced outcomes inconsistent with long-term population stability. Long-term population stability was, in consortium administrative language, the closest possible formulation to "we built something that is destroying the people it was supposed to administer, and we have now acknowledged this in writing." It was not justice. Marin published a document making this clear immediately in the same channel she'd used for everything else, because it was critically important that the people most affected by the system understand what the acknowledgement was and what it wasn't. It was not reparation. It was not reconstruction. It was not the 1,247 people on Fisher's list being given back what they'd lost, or the years of debt servitude being undone, or the medical care decisions of a generation being reconsidered. It was a sentence in a committee's preliminary findings. It was the first sentence of its kind. It was the crack in the wall that let the light in, not the wall coming down. Marin had been writing about cracks in walls for 6 years. She knew what they meant and what they didn't mean. She documented this one with the same precision she'd brought to everything else. This is what it is. This is what it is not. This is what it took to get here. This is what it means to be here. She published it and watched it go out across the channels, and she thought about Fisher saying the door was different when it was a choice rather than an exit, and about the young woman in the hollow telling the assessment team member that the books were organized by what they meant, and about Orla counting 43 minutes because she'd decided to count, and about Eli humming his mother's song across a hospital room while Sophie heard it before she reached him. She thought about 1,247 names and the people who had found the door before they were desperate and what it meant to know a door existed. She thought about the Veld administrative supervisor on the review committee who had taken a list of 812 human beings in its own hands and carried it away. She did not know what it meant. She documented what was there. She picked up her recorder. She kept working. Fabian found her the morning the preliminary findings published in her relay station where she'd been working through the night. He brought food, actual food, not reconstituted, which meant he'd traded for it from one of the Hollow's growing exchange networks, a whole informal economy of skills and surplus that had developed in the 2 years since the original documentation without anyone planning it and without the consortium having a classification for it. He put the food in front of her. He sat across from her. He had the expression of someone who wants to say something significant and is deciding how to frame it. The findings, he said, yes. It's not enough. I know. People are going to think it's enough. That's why I published the piece about what it isn't, she said. That's why I'm going to keep publishing the documentation about what the actual situation on the ground still looks like, so that the sentence in the committee's findings doesn't become the story and the people in the hollow stop being the story. He nodded. He looked at the food he'd brought. You need to sleep, he said. I need to finish this section, after this section, after this section. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. He ate. She drank the coffee he'd also brought, which was real and hot, and which she held with both hands the way she held everything warm, a habit she'd developed in the years of working in relay stations with inadequate climate control. I think about the supervisor sometimes, Fabian said. The one who took the list. I think about that too. What do you think it means, he said, honestly. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. She was very honest about the limits of what she knew, about the line between documentation and speculation. She tried always to be more careful than she needed to be on that line, because credibility was the only currency she had that couldn't be taxed. I think, she said carefully, that the Veld built their administrative systems without accounting for the possibility of a variable they couldn't quantify, and I think encountering that variable in a concrete form as a list of people who should not have had to disappear, held in one's own hands, is an experience that doesn't process cleanly through administrative frameworks that have no category for it. She paused. I don't know what that produces. I'm documenting it. Do you think it matters? She looked at him. He was asking honestly, not rhetorically. I think, she said, that a system's administrators encountering something their system has no frame for is always a moment of possibility, not certainty. Possibility. She paused. I think 1,247 people on a growing list, and 6 other hollows in 6 other sectors, and a library organized by what things meant, and a sentence in a committee finding that acknowledges structural failure for the first time. I think that's more possibility than existed 2 years ago. Fabian was quiet. Yes, she said. She finished the coffee. She picked up the food he'd brought and ate it properly, because she'd been awake for 20 hours, and Fabian was right, and this was the kind of thing you learned eventually to take care of. Then she picked up her recorder. She had a story to finish.